The homeowners association told their contractor to ignore me. 3 days later, one of their cement trucks sank halfway into the mountain road that runs through my land, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk. Now the strange part is none of this had to happen. Not the truck, not the lawsuit, not the 11-week construction shutdown. All of it could have been avoided if one man had done something very simple. Listen to the guy who built roads for a living. My name's Daniel Mercer. I'm 59 years old, retired civil engineer with the Army Corps. I spent 23 years designing temporary roads and bridges for places most folks would never want to visit. Afghanistan, northern Iraq, parts of Eastern Europe, where the mud could swallow a convoy whole if you misjudged the soil. When you spend that long around dirt, gravel, and heavy vehicles, you develop a kind of instinct for it. The way a hillside holds water, the way certain soil looks stable but isn't. You learn that gravity is patient, and it always wins eventually. After I retired, I wanted quiet. Nothing fancy, just land and trees and a view. So, in 2020, I bought 50 acres up outside a small mountain town called Red Hollow, Colorado. Elevation just over 7,000 feet. Pine forests, rocky slopes, elk wandering through the valley in the morning. The kind of place where the air smells like cold stone and sap. Most people don't realize this about mountain land, but access is everything. If you don't have a road, you basically don't have property. The land I bought had one. It wasn't fancy, just a long gravel road I built myself over the first year after moving in. About 1.25 miles, running from the county highway up through my property, hugging the side of a ridge before leveling out near the upper meadow. I designed it the way we used to design temporary supply routes overseas. Wide drainage ditch, reinforced base layer, compacted gravel surface. Good enough for pickups, small equipment, maybe a light delivery truck, but I knew its limits. Up in those mountains, the soil is loose decomposed granite mixed with clay. When it's dry, it feels solid. When it gets heavy load and vibration, it turns into powder and shifts underneath you. I rated the road for about 6,000 pounds max. A heavy pickup, maybe a small utility truck. Anything bigger would start chewing it up fast. For the first couple years, it was peaceful. Just me, the forest, and the occasional neighbor driving by on ATVs. I built a small cabin on the ridge and spent most mornings drinking coffee on the porch, watching the fog roll through the valley. Then the developers showed up. Across the valley from my land was a big empty slope that got sold to a company planning a luxury subdivision. 40-something homes, big glass windows, ski lodge-style architecture, the kind of project that brings in wealthy folks from Denver looking for a second home. I didn't think much of it at first, until one afternoon, a guy in a white SUV came bouncing up my gravel road like he owned it. He parked near the cabin and stepped out wearing sunglasses, loafers, and that confident smile people use when they assume the conversation will go their way. "Afternoon," he said. "You must be the landowner." I nodded. "Depends who's asking." He chuckled like that was funny. "Name's Victor Hale. I'm the HOA president for the new Ridgerest development going in across the valley." He gestured toward the construction site. "We're starting infrastructure work soon. Roads, foundations, utilities. You know how it goes." I already had a feeling where this conversation was heading. He pointed down my road. "Our engineers noticed something interesting. Your access road cuts straight through this ridge and connects almost perfectly to the lower side entrance." I took a sip of coffee and, "Well," he said casually, "if our contractors used your road, it would shorten the route by about 30 minutes each trip. Otherwise, they have to drive the long loop around the mountain." There it was. He smiled again. "We were hoping you might be open to letting construction traffic use it temporarily." Now, I'm not a difficult guy by nature. I've worked with contractors my entire career. I know projects get messy. So I asked the obvious question. "What kind of traffic?" He waved his hand. "Oh, nothing too serious. Just delivery trucks, building materials, standard stuff." Something in the way, he said, that made the back of my neck itch. "Victor," I said, "my road isn't built for heavy loads. How heavy are we talking?" I looked him in the eye. "If you start running concrete mixers or loaded supply trucks through there, it'll fail. Not maybe it will fail." He tilted his head like he wasn't sure he believed me. "Well," he said, "our contractors are pretty experienced." I almost laughed. Experience doesn't change soil composition. I explained the road design, the gravel depth, the load rating. I even told him about what happens to decomposed granite under vibration at altitude. He listened politely, but I could see the skepticism. Finally, he said, "So, What would it take to make it work? I thought about it. Well, reinforcement, widening, base stabilization. Honestly, probably $60,000 to $70,000 of upgrades. He raised his eyebrows. That much? That's what it costs to build roads in the mountains. He gave me that same confident smile again. Well, maybe we can work something out. And at that moment, I still believed he meant it. But a week later, the first cement truck showed up at the bottom of my road. And that's when I realized Victor Hale had never intended to work anything out at all. The first time I saw that cement truck climbing my road, I honestly thought it had taken a wrong turn. It was early morning, maybe a little after 7. I was out by the tool shed, checking a drainage ditch after a rain the night before, when I heard that deep diesel rumble echoing through the trees. You get used to certain sounds living in the mountains. Wind in the pines, the creek down in the valley, the occasional pickup driving past. But a cement mixer? That's a different animal entirely. Low, heavy mechanical. I walked up the ridge a bit, and sure enough, there was crawling up the gravel grade like some enormous metal beetle. Bright white drums spinning slowly, tires grinding against the road surface. For a second, I just stood there with my hands on my hips, thinking, "You've got to be kidding me." I waved the driver down before he got too far. He rolled the window down and leaned out. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied. "Where are you headed?" "Ridge rest site," he said. "Foundation pour." I nodded toward the road behind him. "You know this is private property, right?" He blinked. "They told us to use this road." "Who's that?" "The HOA guys said the owner was fine with it." I let out a slow breath. Yeah, that's not exactly how that conversation went. The driver looked uncomfortable, the way people do when they realize they've been dropped into the middle of someone else's argument. "Look, man," he said, "I'm just driving the truck." "I know," I said, "and you're about 10,000 pounds heavier than this road can handle." He frowned. "You serious?" "Dead serious." I explained the load rating and what could happen if trucks kept running up the slope. He looked down at the gravel under his tires, then back at me. "So what do you want me to do?" "Back it down and take the mountain loop." He whistled softly. "That's another hour and a half. Still better than sinking a 40,000-pound truck into the hillside." He sat there thinking for a moment, then shrugged. "Fair enough." To his credit, he carefully reversed that massive rig all the way back down the grade. Took him nearly 15 minutes. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, another truck showed up. Then a lumber delivery. Then a flatbed hauling steel beams. Every time I stopped them, every time the driver said the same thing. They told us to use this road. After the 4th incident, I drove down to the Ridgerest construction site myself. It was a busy place already. Bulldozers cutting terraces into the hillside, survey stakes everywhere, workers hauling equipment around like ants building a nest. I found Victor standing near a trailer with a couple contractors. He looked mildly surprised to see me. "Daniel," he said, "beautiful morning, isn't it?" I didn't bother with the small talk. "Why are your trucks using my road?" He leaned against the trailer wall like this was just a casual conversation. "Well, we assumed you were still open to the idea." "I told you, the road couldn't handle heavy loads." He shrugged. "Our engineers took a look. They think it'll be fine." Now that got my attention. "Your engineers inspected my road." "Well, from the plans you described." I stared at him. "You mean they guessed?" One of the contractors chuckled under his breath. Victor's smile tightened just a little. "Look, Daniel, we're on a tight schedule here. Running the long loop adds serious time and fuel costs. Your road makes things much easier. That doesn't change the physics." He crossed his arms. "I think you're being a little overly cautious." Overly cautious. I had heard those words before, usually right before a structure failed somewhere in the world, so I tried one last time to keep things reasonable. "Victor," I said calmly, "I spent 2 decades building roads in war zones. I know what happens when soil fails. I'm telling you right now, if heavy trucks keep using that road, it's going to collapse." He gave me a look that said he had already decided not to believe me. "Well," he said, "we'll keep an eye on it." That phrase right there, "keep an eye on it," that's engineer code for "we're going to do it anyway." I left the site with a bad feeling in my gut. That evening, I sat down at my desk and started documenting everything. Old habit from my army days. I wrote a formal warning letter explaining the load limits and the potential for structural failure. Attached soil data, elevation information, even a basic load analysis. Then I mailed copies to the Ridgerest HOA board and the development company. Certified mail. 3 days later, I sent another, then another. No response. Meanwhile, trucks kept showing up, each one chewing a little deeper into the gravel surface. I started noticing small things, ruts forming along the outside edge of the road, tiny cracks where the slope dropped away toward the forest, warning signs, the kind most people ignore. Finally, I realized talking wasn't going to solve this, so I decided to make the road impossible to use. At the property line near the highway, I installed 2 concrete bollards sunk deep into the ground. Between them, I mounted a steel barrier gate with a heavy digital lock. At the upper entrance near my cabin, I did the same thing. The idea was simple. If they couldn't physically drive onto the road, the problem would stop. When I finished installing the system, I sent Victor one final email. Short and polite. Road is now closed to all construction traffic. Any attempt to bypass barriers will be considered trespassing. His reply came about an hour later. Daniel, you're overreacting. Our contractor has been instructed to continue operations as planned. Victor. I read that message twice. Then I laughed, because at that moment I knew exactly what was going to happen next. Engineers spend years studying soil mechanics, structural loads, failure points, all the complicated math behind why things hold together or fall apart. But sometimes the simplest equation in the world is this: gravity plus arrogance equals disaster. 3 days after I locked the gates, Summit Ridge Construction decided they were done dealing with the barrier. Instead of turning around, one of their drivers steered his cement truck off the road, cut through the edge of the forest, and drove around the gate. When my neighbor called to tell me what he'd just seen, I grabbed my jacket and headed down the hill. By the time I reached the lower stretch of the road, the truck had already made it about 400 feet up the grade. And that's when the ground underneath it finally gave up. By the time I reached the lower bend in the road, I could already see the problem from about 100 yards away. The cement truck was sitting at an awkward angle across the gravel. The front wheels still on solid ground, but the rear axle had dropped into the outer edge of the road where the hillside fell away. Not dramatically, not like some Hollywood landslide, just enough. About 8 inches of collapse under the rear tires. Talking about a truck that weighs 40,000 pounds fully loaded. 8 in might as well be 8 feet. Because once that weight sinks into his soft gravel, the more you try to move it, the worse it gets. The driver was standing outside the cab when I walked up, hands on his hips, staring at the mess like a guy trying to figure out how a bad idea turned into a really expensive one. He looked over when he saw me. You the owner? Yeah, I said. He sighed. I kind of figured. For a moment, we both just looked at the truck. The rear tires had dug deep into the gravel bed, and the outside edge of the road had slumped toward the slope below. Not a catastrophic failure, but enough that if you tried to drive out, the whole thing might slide another foot or two. Let me guess, I said. They told you to go around the barrier. He rubbed the back of his neck. Dispatcher said the HOA cleared it with you. I nodded slowly. That's what they told the last guy too. He glanced down the road, then back at the truck. So what now? Now, I said, you call a recovery rig. He let out a long breath. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. It took nearly 8 hours for the tow company to get up there with the right equipment. 2 heavy wreckers and a winch system anchored to the uphill trees. In the meantime, the truck just sat there like a giant metal monument to poor decision-making. A few construction workers from the Ridgerest site eventually wandered over to see what was going on. Some of them tried not to smile when they realized exactly where the truck had gotten stuck. Around noon, Victor showed up. He came speeding up in that same white SUV, gravel crunching under his tires as he stopped a little too fast near the scene. He got out, looked at the truck, then looked at me. What happened? He asked. I raised an eyebrow. The road failed. His jaw tightened. That's impossible. I pointed toward the rear axle. Gravity disagrees. He walked around the truck, inspecting the damage like maybe the laws of physics had personally betrayed him. Finally, he turned back to me. You closed the gate, he said. Correct. So the driver had to go around it. No, I said calmly. He chose to. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The workers nearby pretended to be very interested in the trees. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're interfering with a major construction project. No, I replied. I'm protecting my property. You're costing us time and money. I shrugged. I warned you. He stared at me for a few seconds, the way someone does when they're deciding whether to threaten or negotiate. He chose threat. You realize we could take legal action. I couldn't help smiling a little. Victor, you sent an email telling your contractor to ignore my warnings. His face changed slightly. My attorney has copies, I added. That was the moment I saw the first crack in his confidence. Later that afternoon, the county inspector arrived. Now here's the thing about county inspectors in small mountain towns. Most of them have been around long enough to know exactly how roads behave in that terrain. The inspector, a woman named Laura McKenna, walked the length of the damaged section with me. I showed her the soil structure, the gravel depth, the drainage lines. She crouched down, picked up a handful of loose granite, and let it fall through her fingers. Then she looked over at Victor. "What's the rated load for this road?" she asked. "Private road," he said quickly. "Temporary access." She shook her head. "That wasn't my question." He hesitated. I answered for him. 6,000 pounds. She nodded once. "And that truck?" I glanced at the driver. "About 40,000 loaded." Laura stood up, brushed off her hands, and wrote something on her clipboard. Then she turned back to Victor. "All construction vehicles are prohibited from using this road effective immediately." Victor opened his mouth to argue. She cut him off. "County order." And just like that, the entire Ridgerest development lost its shortcut. For the next 11 weeks, every single truck hauling material to that site had to drive the 90-minute mountain loop around the ridge. Fuel costs went through the roof. Schedules slipped, subcontractors started missing deadlines, and the big one, their primary builder contract, included a delay penalty clause, $340,000. Victor tried to fight it. About a month after the truck incident, I received a notice that the HOA intended to sue me for something called tortious interference, basically claiming I had intentionally sabotaged their project. My attorney almost laughed when he read it. The court hearing lasted 15 minutes. The judge flipped through the documents, the warning letters, the soil report, Victor's email, telling contractors to ignore me, and he looked over his glasses and said, very calmly, "Case dismissed." That should have been the end of it. But a funny thing happens when expensive projects start bleeding money. People's attitudes change. About 2 weeks after the lawsuit collapsed, Victor drove up to my cabin again. This time, he didn't bring the sunglasses or the confident smile. He stood on the porch while I poured 2 cups of coffee. For a moment, we just listened to the wind moving through the pines. Finally, he cleared his throat. "What would it take?" he asked. I had already thought about that question. "A proper road upgrade," I said. "Reinforced base, wider shoulders, drainage, stabilization." He nodded slowly. "An access 3-year agreement." He leaned back in the chair. "How much?" $3,500 a month. He went slightly but didn't argue. "And heavy vehicles over 10,000 pounds pay $200 per crossing." That part made him blink. Per crossing road, where isn't free? We sat there quietly for a minute while he did the math in his head. Finally, he sighed. "Late payment 72 hours, I said. "After that, the gate locks automatically." He stared out at the valley for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. "Deal." Over the next month, the development company spent $75,000 rebuilding my road to proper mountain specifications. New gravel base, reinforced edges, drainage pipes, the whole thing. By the time they finished it, could handle the cement trucks without breaking a sweat. And for the next 3 years, those trucks paid toll every time they crossed my property. Between the monthly access fee and the heavy vehicle crossings, the road ended up bringing in about $126,000. Not bad for a road I originally built just to reach my cabin. These days, when I sit on the porch in the morning, I sometimes watch those big mixer trucks roll past on their way to the subdivision. They move a lot slower now. Drivers stop at the gate, punch in the access code, and ease their way up the hill like they're crossing a bridge made of glass. Funny how quickly people start respecting load limits once they've watched a truck sink into the mountain. Now, I'm curious about something. Have you ever had someone completely ignore your professional expertise, act like you were overreacting, and then blame you when the problem you warned them about actually happened? I'd really like to hear those stories. Drop them in the comments. Because if there's one thing I've learned after 30 years around construction sites, gravity is patient, but arrogance usually gets there.